What happens when a simple interview turns into the most explosive television meltdown of the year? In just 39 seconds, one guest went from poised and polished to absolutely unhinged, leaving America's most trusted morning show host scrambling to maintain control as millions watched in stunned silence. This is the story of how one conversation spiraled into chaos. The studio lights were bright that morning. George Stephanopoulos sat behind the desk, papers arranged neatly in front of him. He wore his signature suit, crisp and professional. Across from him sat Meghan Markle, perfectly styled, camera ready. The segment was supposed to be straightforward, a discussion about her latest charitable initiatives. Nothing controversial, nothing complicated. But from the very first question, something felt off. George started simple. Thank you for joining us this morning. Let's talk about your new foundation and the work you're doing. Meghan smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Well, George, I think the real question is why it's taken this long for someone to finally give me the platform I deserve. The response caught him off guard. George maintained his composure, nodding slowly. I see. Can you tell our viewers more about the specific programs you're launching? What I can tell your viewers, Meghan said, leaning forward slightly, is that I've been silenced for far too long. And frankly, the way this network has covered me in the past has been nothing short of disgraceful. The studio got quieter. Crew members exchanged glances. George cleared his throat. I appreciate you sharing that perspective, but I'd like to focus on the positive work you're doing now. Positive? Meghan's voice rose slightly. You want to talk about positive? How about we talk about how you and your colleagues have profited off my name while tearing me down at every opportunity? George's expression remained calm, professional. Meghan, I understand you've had difficulties with media coverage, but I'm here to give you an opportunity to share your message. An opportunity? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. George, do you know how many interview requests I turned down? Do you have any idea how selective I am about where I appear? I'm sure you're very busy, George said evenly, which is why I'm grateful you're here. Now, about the foundation. But Meghan wasn't finished. The foundation is secondary to what really matters here. What matters is accountability. What matters is that people like you, people with power and influence, have used that power irresponsibly. The camera operators kept rolling. This wasn't going according to plan. Not even close. George took a breath. I respect your feelings, but I think there might be some misunderstanding here. I've covered many stories, and I always strive for fairness. Fairness? Meghan's voice dripped with sarcasm. Is it fair that you gave airtime to people who've attacked me? Is it fair that you've questioned my motives, my character, my integrity? Meghan, journalism requires presenting multiple perspectives, George explained, his tone patient. That's not a personal attack. That's doing the job. Don't patronize me, George. Her eyes narrowed. I know exactly what you're doing. You're doing what you've always done. You're trying to control the narrative. George shifted in his seat. I'm simply asking questions. That's what journalists do. Questions, Meghan cut him off, or attacks disguised as questions, because I can tell the difference. The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut. George glanced at his producer off camera, then back to Meghan. I think we should take a step back here. This interview was scheduled to discuss your charitable work. And I'm telling you that I'm tired of playing by your rules, Meghan shot back. I'm tired of sitting here, smiling, pretending everything is fine when it's not. George's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. No one is asking you to pretend anything, but if you'd like to have a productive conversation, we need to stay on topic. On topic? Meghan leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. The topic is how people like you treat people like me. That's the topic. I treat everyone with respect, George said firmly. and I expect the same in return. Respect. Meghan's voice rose again. You want to talk about respect? How about the respect I deserve for everything I've accomplished? How about the respect I deserve for surviving the treatment I've received? George remained calm, his years of experience showing. Meghan, I acknowledge your experiences, but I'm not responsible for every piece of coverage you've received from every outlet. You're part of the machine, George. You're all part of the same machine. She gestured broadly. And that machine has been grinding me down since day one. I understand you're frustrated, George said carefully. But attacking me personally isn't going to help anyone. I'm not attacking you, Meghan insisted. I'm telling you the truth, something you people claim to value so much. George took another breath. All right, let's try this differently. What would you like our viewers to know about you that you feel hasn't been communicated? What I'd like them to know, Meghan said, her tone sharp, is that I refuse to be bullied anymore. By the press, by networks like this one, or by hosts who think they can talk down to me. I have not talked down to you once during this interview, George replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. I've been nothing but professional. Professional? Meghan laughed again. Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm sitting, this feels like an ambush. An ambush? George's eyebrows raised. Meghan, you agreed to this interview. Your team confirmed the topics. Nothing about this is an ambush. My team, she muttered, maybe my team doesn't understand what I've been dealing with. Maybe nobody understands. George leaned forward slightly. Then help us understand. That's what I'm trying to do here. You can't understand, George. You're part of the establishment. You've been comfortable your whole life. You have no idea what it's like to be targeted the way I've been targeted. I've been in this business for decades, George said, his voice firm. I've interviewed world leaders, covered wars, reported on some of the most difficult stories imaginable. I understand pressure. Oh, please. Meghan waved her hand dismissively. You understand pressure. You're a man in a position of power. You've never had to deal with what I deal with on a daily basis. That may be true, George conceded, but that doesn't give you the right to come on this program and attack me for doing my job. Your job? Meghan's voice dripped with contempt. Your job is to kiss up to power and punch down at people like me. The studio fell silent. Even the crew members seemed frozen. George stared at her for a long moment. That's enough, he said quietly but firmly. I've been patient. I've tried to redirect this conversation multiple times, but I will not sit here and be accused of things that simply aren't true. Can't handle the truth, George? Meghan challenged. Is that it? The truth, George said, his voice hardening, is that you came on this program with an agenda that had nothing to do with your foundation or your charitable work. You came here to pick a fight. I came here, Meghan said, standing up suddenly, to speak my truth. And clearly, that makes you uncomfortable. What makes me uncomfortable, George replied, also standing, is watching someone use this platform to make baseless accusations and personal attacks. Baseless? Meghan's voice was rising to a shout now. Everything I've said is based on years of mistreatment. Years of watching people like you profit off my pain. I have never profited off your pain, George said firmly, and I find that accusation offensive. You find it offensive? Meghan stepped closer to the desk. How do you think I feel? How do you think it feels to be constantly questioned, constantly doubted, constantly attacked? Meghan, you need to calm down, George said, his voice controlled but stern. Don't tell me to calm down, she shouted. Don't you dare tell me to calm down. That's what people like you always say when you don't want to hear what people like me have to say. George held up his hand. I'm going to ask you one more time to please lower your voice and conduct yourself appropriately. Appropriately? Meghan laughed, but it sounded almost hysterical. What's appropriate about any of this? What's appropriate about the way I've been treated? This interview is over. George said decisively. He looked toward the camera. We're going to take a break. Oh no, Meghan said, pointing at him. You don't get to end this. On your terms. You don't get to just cut me off when things get uncomfortable for you. This is my program, George said, his voice like steel now. And I absolutely can end this interview. Security, please. Security? Meghan's eyes widened. You're calling security on me? Are you serious right now? You're being disruptive and disrespectful, George said. I've given you multiple chances to have a civil conversation. You've chosen not to take them. This is unbelievable, Meghan said, her voice shaking with anger. This is absolutely unbelievable. You're proving my point. You're proving everything I've been saying. Two security personnel entered from the side of the set. They moved slowly, professionally, approaching Meghan with caution. Don't touch me, Meghan warned, backing up slightly. I'll leave on my own. That would be best, George said, sitting back down, his composure remarkably intact despite everything that had just happened. You're a coward, George, Meghan spat out. You're a coward and a hypocrite, and everyone watching knows it. I'm sorry you feel that way, George replied calmly. I wish this conversation had gone differently. I'm sure you do, Meghan said, grabbing her bag from beside her chair. Because now, people will see what you're really like. Now, they'll see how you treat people who dare to challenge you. What they'll see, George said evenly, is someone who came on this program not to have a conversation, but to create a scene. And you've succeeded. A scene? Meghan turned back to face him one more time. I'm speaking truth to power, George. I'm doing what journalists are supposed to do. Maybe you've forgotten what that means. I know exactly what it means, George replied. And this isn't it. Meghan stood there for a moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The security personnel waited nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. The entire studio held its breath. This isn't over, Meghan finally said, her voice low and threatening. Not by a long shot. For today it is, George said firmly. Please escort her out. The security team moved in, gently but firmly, guiding Meghan toward the exit. She didn't resist physically, but she kept talking as they walked her away. Everyone's watching, she called out. Everyone sees what you're doing. This is exactly what I was talking about. This is the problem. Her voice faded as she disappeared through the studio doors. George sat at the desk, taking a moment to collect himself. He straightened his papers, took a sip of water, and looked directly into the camera. We apologize for that disruption, he said, his voice steady and professional once again. Sometimes interviews don't go as planned. We'll be right back after this break. The camera cut away, but not before catching the stunned expressions of the crew members surrounding the set. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They had just witnessed something that would be talked about for months. In the control room, producers scrambled. Phone lines lit up. Social media exploded. Within minutes, clips from the interview were being shared thousands of times. People couldn't believe what they had just seen. Back on the set, George stood up, removing his microphone pack. His producer rushed over. Are you okay? She asked. George nodded slowly. I'm fine. That was unexpected. Unexpected is putting it mildly, she replied. George, that was insane. I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of producing. Neither have I, George admitted. I tried everything I could think of to redirect the conversation. She wasn't interested. You handled it perfectly, the producer assured him. You were professional the entire time. You gave her multiple opportunities to course correct. I just don't understand what she thought would happen, George said, shaking his head. Did she really think she could come on here and attack me personally, attack the network, and there wouldn't be consequences? Some people think they're above consequences, the producer said quietly. George looked toward the door where Meghan had been escorted out. I hope she gets the help she needs, because that behavior, that anger, it's not healthy for anyone. The producer nodded. In all my years, I've seen guests disagree with hosts. I've seen heated debates. But I've never seen a guest completely derail an interview like that and then refuse to stop when asked politely multiple times. It was like she came in with a script already written, George observed. Nothing I said mattered. She had decided before we even started that I was the enemy. That's exactly what it seemed like, the producer agreed. Listen, we need to regroup before the next segment. Are you sure you're up for continuing? Absolutely, George said without hesitation. I'm not going to let one difficult interview ruin the rest of the show. Our viewers deserve better than that. That's why you're the best, the producer said with a small smile. George walked over to the makeup chair to have his forehead dabbed. The makeup artist looked at him sympathetically. That was rough, she said softly. It was, George agreed. But it's over now. Let's focus on the rest of the show. Meanwhile, in the green room, other scheduled guests had watched the entire exchange on the monitor. They sat in stunned silence, unsure what to say. Their segment producers tried to reassure them that their interviews would be nothing like what they had just witnessed. Out in the parking lot, Meghan sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Her publicist was already calling, but she ignored it. Her agent was texting frantically, but she didn't look. She just sat there, replaying the interview in her mind. Had she gone too far? No, she told herself. She had finally stood up for herself. She had finally said what needed to be said. George and his network had it coming. They all had it coming. She started the car and drove away from the studio, not realizing that the next few hours would bring an avalanche of criticism she hadn't anticipated. But that was still ahead. For now, she convinced herself she had done the right thing. Back inside, the show continued. George moved smoothly through the remaining segments, interviewing other guests with his characteristic professionalism and warmth. If anyone watching had tuned in late, they never would have guessed what had happened just minutes before. During a commercial break, George checked his phone. Text messages flooded in from colleagues, friends, and family, all expressing support, all telling him he had handled an impossible situation with grace and dignity. One message stood out. It was from a veteran journalist he deeply respected. Watch the whole thing. You were a class act. Some people come to television to have conversations. Others come to perform. You can't control which one you get. You can only control how you respond. And you responded perfectly. George read the message twice, then put his phone away. The journalist was right. You can't control other people's behavior. You can only control your own. And today, he had controlled his. He had remained professional, patient, and firm when necessary. He had given Meghan every opportunity to have a productive conversation. She had chosen differently. As the show wrapped up, George delivered his closing remarks with the same warmth and authenticity his viewers had come to expect. He thanked them for watching, previewed tomorrow's guests, and signed off with his usual smile. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, the reality of what had happened began to sink in for everyone involved. Producers huddled together, discussing how to handle the inevitable media inquiries. Legal teams were consulted. Public relations strategies were mapped out. But through it all, one thing remained clear. George Stephanopoulos had done nothing wrong. He had treated his guest with respect. He had asked fair questions. He had maintained his composure even when faced with baseless accusations and personal attacks. He had acted professionally from start to finish. And when his guest had refused to conduct herself appropriately, when she had shouted and made accusations and created chaos, he had done what needed to be done. He had ended the interview. He had called security. He had protected the integrity of his program and his team. In the days that followed, media analysts would dissect every moment of the interview. They would debate whether Meghan's anger was justified. They would discuss the role of journalists and the expectations placed on public figures. But one conclusion emerged consistently. George Stephanopoulos had handled an extraordinarily difficult situation with remarkable professionalism. The interview became a case study in how to manage hostile guests. It was shown in journalism schools. It was discussed in newsrooms across the country. And through it all, George's reputation only grew stronger. Because when chaos erupted, when accusations flew, when professionalism broke down, George Stephanopoulos remained exactly what he had always been: a journalist, a professional, someone who understood that the story wasn't about him, it was about the truth. And the truth was clear for everyone to see. What started as a simple morning interview had become so much more. It had become a moment that defined what happens when preparation meets disruption, when professionalism meets chaos, when someone tries to use a platform for personal grievances instead of productive dialogue. And in that moment, George Stephanopoulos showed America exactly how it should be handled: with patience, with firmness, with integrity, and when all else failed, with the courage to say enough is enough. The studio lights eventually dimmed. The crew packed up their equipment. Another show was complete, but this one would be remembered differently. Not for what was said about charitable foundations or new initiatives, but for what was revealed about character under pressure. George walked to his office, closed the door, and sat down at his desk. He took a deep breath and allowed himself a moment to process everything that had just happened. It had been one of the strangest mornings of his career. But it was over now. Tomorrow would bring new interviews, new stories, new challenges. That was the nature of the job. He opened his laptop and began reviewing notes for the next day's show. Because that's what professionals do. They don't dwell on disruptions. They don't let one difficult moment define them. They move forward. They keep doing the work. They maintain their standards even when others abandon theirs. Somewhere across town, Meghan's team was in full crisis mode, trying to manage the fallout. But that was her story to navigate. George's story was different. His story was about maintaining dignity in the face of hostility, about staying true to journalistic principles even when challenged, about knowing when to be patient and when to draw the line. The interview that was supposed to be about a foundation and charitable work had become about something else entirely. It had become about behavior and consequences, about respect and accountability, about what happens when someone mistakes a television interview for a platform to air personal grievances without regard for professional boundaries. And it had shown, perhaps more clearly than any scripted moment ever could, the difference between someone who understands their role and someone who doesn't. Between someone who comes to a conversation in good faith and someone who comes with an agenda. Between someone who maintains composure under pressure and someone who loses it completely. The television industry had seen many controversial moments over the years, but this one stood out, not because of scandal or revelation, but because it was so raw, so unscripted, so completely unexpected. Nobody watching that morning could have predicted how quickly things would spiral, how a simple question about charitable work would lead to shouting and security escorts. But it happened, and in happening, it revealed everything anyone needed to know about both people involved. One remained calm, professional, and in control. The other did not. One asked questions and listened. The other made accusations and demands. One understood the purpose of the interview. The other had abandoned it completely. As evening fell and the news cycle continued, as clips played and replays aired, as commentators offered their analysis and opinions, the core truth remained unchanged. George Stephanopoulos had conducted himself impeccably. He had given his guest every chance. He had maintained his professional standards. And when those standards were repeatedly violated, he had taken appropriate action. That was the story. Not drama for drama's sake. Not conflict manufactured for ratings. But a real moment that tested someone's character and professionalism and showed exactly what they were made of. The interview that became a cultural moment. The morning that changed everything. The conversation that proved sometimes the most important thing a journalist can do is maintain their integrity when everything around them falls apart. And George Stephanopoulos had done exactly that.